year or so are telling us about how communities in fragile contexts are being affected by and are thinking about climate impacts, the support they're asking for, and the strategies that they themselves have underway to adapt and thrive. So we see a number of things really clearly. Across countries and across communities, we hear how climate impacts are hitting harder and how that's affecting people's lives and livelihoods and the ways that people are thinking about their own futures. We hear that where humanitarian aid is getting through, it's not as effective as it could be in helping people cope, helping people prepare, helping people recover from climate impacts. But perhaps conversely, where it's being cut off, it's really pushing people's coping mechanisms to exhaustion. And we see this quote here from a local NGO in Somalia. We've just been doing some work around how communities are coping with the drought, who reflected on the fact that this is really the first big climate shock that these communities that we were talking to have weathered without any humanitarian aid, and how it's really affecting how people are coping and the strategies that they have in place. People are calling for support with their own adaptation strategies, and people are calling for aid which goes beyond the basic life-saving package, to take environmental protection into account, to help people prepare, and to invest in the upstream adaptation investments that stop climate hazards from turning into climate disasters. So across countries, it's very, very clear that people are talking about not only worsening climate impacts, but also how the hazards that have always affected them are fundamentally changing. So we see on the screen quotes which describe this double shock drought that's happening in Somalia right now, where the river and the rain have both gone down at the same time. That's new for people. We hear how people's water access strategies in Afghanistan have changed fundamentally over the last decade. And we hear from Chad how climate impacts are reducing yields and are making livelihoods more and more difficult. When we talk to people about how that's affecting their lives, we hear how people are unable to cope. The data on the right of the screen shows to what extent people feel able to cope with environmental challenges right now. And the data when we ask about the future is even worse than this. So we see examples from Ethiopia and from Somalia, where people are reflecting that they're worried about the future. If there's no intervention, they will see a situation where survival becomes difficult. Is humanitarian aid helping? Well, yes and no. So humanitarian aid isn't generally seen as that effective in helping people prepare for and recover from crises. We have data here from Chad about the extent to which humanitarian aid helps. The picture is not completely terrible, but not great. Whenever we talk to communities in these situations, they are always talking to us and thinking about how they can get support with their adaptation strategies, with their long-term aspirations, and they're very rarely thinking about the short-term aid that humanitarians can provide. And lots of the data that came from Somalia is about avoiding at all costs being in a situation where people have to become displaced, where people have to move to camps, and there enter a situation where livelihoods are not an option. There's a feeling of permanent precarity. And again, people are calling for upstream investment. Interestingly, when we talk to people about early warnings and we talk to people about the information they're getting about climate hazards, we hear two things. We're hearing some places that those early warnings aren't getting through, or that they're not getting through in a way that people can engage with. So here in Afghanistan, 2/3 of people said they got no early warning around climate hazards. And the other thing we hear is that they're not trusted in many contexts. So here in Somalia, again, around the current drought, people told us quite clearly that they don't listen to official early warnings anymore because they have been let down in the past, and because that has led them to make decisions which have harmed them in the long run. We also hear that because of the changing nature of some of these hazards, early warning, traditional early warning, is not as effective as it used to be. So, as is very clear to everyone in this room, communities obviously have multiple strategies to prepare for and adapt to climate impacts, both short-term and long-term. This picture that you're seeing was taken by a colleague of ours in Hadjalamis in Chad. It's a flood dike that the communities come together to build when they received information through traditional early warning systems that the flood was coming. And here in Somalia, below in Somalia, we hear about how communities are raising money from financial networks. They're contracting people to come in and address climate vulnerabilities, but how all of that is very fragile and dependent on resources and shocks that come. There's also, I should say, quite widespread frustration when we have those conversations that community-led efforts aren't adequately recognised by and supported by humanitarian actors. We heard stories in Somalia about communities raising money for access roads, building their own wells, needing only a very narrow kind of technical support. And the only support that they could access from NGOs, from humanitarian actors, was full package of support, well building from start to finish with no technical skills handed over. So that's a big issue. But many of these community-led strategies have really hit a wall as resources contract. And that's not just to do with aid cuts, that's also to do with worsening political situations, bigger climate impacts, protracted crises. But in the current drought in Somalia, we are hearing from community leaders how people are in a cycle of depletion where, as one person put it, the herds eat themselves. So people are quite quickly getting into a situation where they're using the most extreme coping strategies, and then it's quite hard to bounce back from that. Here again, in Chad, people say we have all these strategies underway, we know what to do if a flood is coming, but we can only do those things if we receive support and if we have the financial means to do so. So across countries, we see people's laser focus on adapting and strengthening their livelihoods to climate impacts and the need for external support to do that effectively. People across countries, especially in the most climate vulnerable sectors, express concern about how viable their livelihoods will be in the future, as you see on the right here in Somalia. And in general, people are relatively clear about the inputs and adaptations they need and they want, just not how to finance them. So here we see a quote from Somalia. If things continue as they are, I am not sure how viable farming and livestock rearing will be here without support. And a call from DRC for additional support around agriculture to make sure that people are able to continue their livelihood even as environmental conditions change and worsen. And communities recognise, of course, that there's a limit to what they themselves can do to adapt. So people are very clear that they want upstream adaptation investments to ensure that their communities can continue to feed and sustain themselves as conditions worsen and to prevent climate hazards from turning into climate disasters. In Somalia, for example, when we asked people what they needed to better cope with climate hazards, the respondents kind of split in 3 equal groups, and the 3 groups were asking for better access to water through wells, reservoirs and canals, for protective shelters, and for better flood management and infrastructure. The question that I have for this panel today is, where are these investments going to come from now in this context, in context facing conflict and vulnerability? So just before turning to the panel, I think it's very clear to us that in all the noise around aid cuts and the understandable focus on worsening conflict and violence around the world, climate is really falling off the agenda in the places we work. Acting to prevent climate hazards from turning into climate disasters in these places is urgent and is becoming more urgent by the day. What we want to do, and my kind of loose invitation to all of you today, is we want to work with all of you to raise the alarm about climate impacts and the urgent need for climate action. It's been done. Everyone on this panel has been instrumental in raising the alarm, advocating for more climate action in fragile places, but we are really worried that that progress is under threat. So next month, we'll put together all of the data that I've shared with you, plus a lot more, into a short report. We're then going to put out a call for additional evidence. So if you are sitting on, your organisation is sitting on insights data from communities in the places we work about how they're being impacted by, how they're adapting to climate impacts and the support they need, please join us. We want to come together with some very clear advocacy messages and go into COP together as a united front. So that was my little plug. But without further ado, I want to turn to so Paul, I'm going to turn to you first of all. I've made lots of big claims about how tentative climate progress has reversed. Is that right? What do you see having happened over the last year in terms of the progress we've made around climate action in fragile states?
Thanks. First of all, before I answer the question, just kudos and to ground truth for the work they've done. I think it's fascinating and really, really important. And I would back that call for bringing all of that information together. In answering your question, I feel, that story about the blind man and the elephant, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I know I've got a bit, I've got hold. So let me describe the bit that I've seen that I've got hold of. I think it's a catastrophe. I think it's been catastrophic here. And, a huge amount of excellent work has been shredded, really. The question, though, I think that you're asking is it worse for climate and the work around understanding and responding to climate risk than it is for any other area of humanitarian action, rather than is it bad? Yes, it's bad. Is it worse? I think that's a bit more nuanced, perhaps. What I've seen with the organisations that we've been working with over the last year is a number of things. VHA, so first of all, I think the funding was definitely moving in the right direction. I think VHA, while VHA, in its final iteration, was actually becoming very aware of and oriented towards climate issues. And so obviously the money has gone. And I think a lot of programs fell over very quickly. And it wasn't just because that VHA money had been taken away, but it's because, quite rightly, climate's not a sector. It shouldn't be a sector. It's a part of other pieces of work. And it was like Jenga, as many of you will have experienced. When the VHA money went away, clinics which weren't based on the VHA money, but required the VHA money to kind of prop up the ECHO money and so on, the whole thing collapsed. And so the climate activities that were based around and out of those clinics or out of those programs stopped. I think there was also a thing about the chilling effect, that I think a lot of agencies got really scared of the C word, or the, CC. And it's been interesting to see how that has kind of changed or changed. I think it's changed to a degree. I think actually the viciousness and the damage is much more around women's rights than it is around climate. And that, in terms of what we see. And organizations are not as tentative as they maybe were, 8 to 10 months ago about that. I think also a lot of the resources, the sort of particular resources in the United States, which one would use for climate programming, and that I think we expected would fall over. Lots of stuff came off the web, there's lots of 404s and the information wasn't available, but actually that's kind of crept back as well. So a year on, to me, the bit of the elephant I've got hold of is maybe it's shaken out a certain number of actors who were, how to put this? No, let's just say it, who were really in it for the loss and damage money, and who were looking at climate as another way of kind of fundraising. But the agencies like those represented here, of course, the movement, the Red Cross movement, which has got a long history in this, Mercy Corps, International Medical Corps, Save the Children, NRC, the agencies who'd consistently been working on this, I think are continuing to work on it, albeit at a small scale. Which sort of begs the question of where does it go from here? Can I go there for a second?
Please.
Yeah. So there's this humanitarian reset thing. And, at first sight, the focus on life saving doesn't seem very productive, I think, for looking at the drivers of misery rather than the immediate moment that you pass from life to death. But I find the life saving piece actually rather more ambiguous. I don't know, maybe I haven't just read enough. But it seems to cover, for example, in the ISC Q&A, it's much more about protecting lives, which, let's face this, there's not a lot of life, there's not a lot of, search and rescue that humanitarians do. Most of humanitarian work is long-term life protection, not the saving of life. And that's where climate comes in, of course, because that protection gets more difficult. And in the ISC Q&A is sort of saying it's about protecting lives. It's about embedding resilience from day one, which is kind of, I think, quite interesting in something which is about saving lives. I'm not quite sure how all of that fits together. Then that's much more positive. About, you know, looking not only at need, but actually the, you know, the proximate drivers and, you know, the ultimate drivers. And the great thing is, it's not, you know, it's not going to be me or you know, anyone in capital who makes those decisions, because if the reset does, you know, work as planned, those decisions get decentralized and they get localized about how the money is going to be spent. And that's a good thing for climate, because we were just seeing, it might seem a long way from real humanitarianism here, but I don't think it feels a long way from humanitarian action in places like Somalia or South Sudan or Yemen. And so actually having local organizations making the decision, and local organizations are often the most climate aware and who are driving the agenda forward, I think would make a big difference in this, as will any kind of concern around efficiency, because it's really not efficient. And I think this is what the BHA was cracking onto. It's really not efficient to have your latrines collapse and your boreholes flood, you know, every 2 years. It's just not a good use of money. So climate resilience and building in some of this climate proofing speaks directly into that efficiency piece. So maybe that thing about the reset, maybe it ended up being good news. The other thing, and I think Kathleen Loon and others can speak far more eloquently, so I'll just note it, is of course, and I think you brought it up very well there, Sophie, is it's not all about us anyway. The question is, how is climate finance from the banks? How is climate finance from the funds moving? You know, we saw the GCF going to Somalia. You know, there seems to be that movement. There still seems to be pace in that movement. So maybe the humanitarian financing is not the big deal. Maybe the big deal is, or another big deal is happening somewhere else. And then the last thing I'd just like to say is it kind of doesn't, none of the above really matters. And sorry, I think Abdurrahman will have some very interesting things hopefully to say about that. So I won't go any further with that. It doesn't really matter if there's lots of money or not any money, if the money's not being well spent, you know, if it's just being spent on rubbish. Yeah, and the issue of the quality of these humanitarian engagements with climate, I think, is every bit as important as the availability of funding. And I think we've got to be really careful. You know, one of the things about the slow progress that these organizations have made is it's not based on flashy innovation tools. You know, that it's not based on the magic bullet that's going to cure climate change. It's not based on the single sector, you know, just going at kind of building these big climate projects. It's about taking the reality of climate risk and asking in each and every place, in each and every project, what does that mean for gender? What does that mean for WASH? What does that mean for health? And what does that mean for livelihoods? And I think if we're not doing that, but we're kind of going for these big win kind of, you know, then that's not money well spent. Similarly, I think we probably haven't taken enough account of the dangers of maladaptation. And I think one of the individuals you quoted there brought that up. You know, should we really be supporting agro-pastoral communities to continue to be agro-pastoralists in areas where that will not be possible in 10 years' time? You know, I think there are some big ethical issues around this, and maybe this debate is now at a level of maturity where we can address that. So that's the bit of the elephant I got hold of.
Thank you so much. And I've found lots of reasons to be hopeful in what you've just said that I didn't have before this panel. So thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Abdirahman, who's joining us online from the government of Somalia. Abdirahman, would be really interested to hear from your perspective, how does this slowing reversal in progress look and feel from the Somalia perspective? And what are the impacts, if any, these changes to international support to the progress that you have been able to make on fighting climate change in Somalia?
Thank you very much for your questions, and it is pleasure to join this meeting discussions. As you know that my name is Abdurrahman. I'm from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, leading the climate resilience agenda in Somalia. Also, climate-related programming in Somalia, focusing on resilience buildings and new partnerships, strengthening community-based response to climate shocks. Uh, Much of my work involving supported programs that help vulnerable communities and adapt to climate change, manage climate risk to recover from the recurrent droughts and floods. When we talk about the reversals in progress in Somalia, it is not an abstract concept, but it is something communities experienced very visibly in their daily lives. So you see that over the past decades, Somalia has made gradually progress in rebuilding livelihoods and strengthening resilience after years of conflict and humanitarian crisis. As you know that farmers in riverine areas such as started restoring agricultural productions, pastoralists were rebuilding their livestock herds, and in many communities were slowly transitioning from the emergency aid towards more sustainable development pathway. However, repeated climate shocks have disrupted in this progress, and Somalia has experienced some of the longest and most severe drought in the recent history. So, following by intense flood seasons, the extreme weather patterns have devastating sequence for the communities whose livelihood depending large on rain-fed agriculture and pastures. So with the what reversal progress look like in practice, it is that the farmers who had recovered from previous crisis are once again losing their productive assets, livestock, which were the backbones of the pastoral's livelihood, died during the prolonged drought due to lack of water and pasture. So you see that farmers loses crops, and when rainfall fails or when floods destroys farmlands along the river basins. So this creates cycles where communities move repeatedly between recovery, crisis, rather than being able to build long-term resilience. So you know that for many households, in the reversals also means increasing level of displacement, food insecurity, loss of livelihood opportunity. And you know that families who were previously self-reliant are focused on relying again on humanitarian assistance. So you know that you see that children are taken out of schools, families are struggling to cope with the economic stress when women and girls are often faces increased burdens, including travel longer distance to access water or a fuel. So there is another important dimensions in the climate shocks where we say that are placing additional pressure on already fragile systems in Somalia, where including like water resource infrastructure and local market. So you see that climate change is not only a humanitarian issue, but it's also a development and stability change. So that is my question. And regarding to the impact of funding cut change to the international support, then these effects are very ideal. As you know that climate adaptation and resilience program in Somalia are heavily on international support, and these programs include investment on water infrastructure, early warning systems, climate smart agriculture, disaster risk reductions, and community resilience initiatives. And when fund becomes uncertain or when international priorities shift and many of these program faces delay, scrolling down or discontinuations, these weakens the progress that community and institutions have been making toward climate adaptation. So you see that in many cases, short-term humanitarian funding continues during the crisis, but long-term resilience and adaptation investment remains insufficient. So without sustained financing for adaptation, community remains vulnerable to the next drought or floods. So these are broader climate justice dimension to this discussion. You see that Somalia's contribute extremely little to global greenhouse emissions. and yet it is among the countries experiencing the most severe impact of the climate change. So these imbalance highlight the importance of ensuring that frontline countries receive adequate climate finance to adapt in the building scenarios. So in terms of how Somalia can better access the global climate finance is we see that they can access Somalia global finance in many ways. For example, like we say that first, Somalia need to become more accessible to the fragile and conflict-affected countries. And many funds, such as like Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility, have a complex application and accreditation process that can be difficult for countries with limited institution capacity to navigate. Secondly, there is a strengthening capacity of our national institutions, such as the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, is essential so that they can effectively access, manage, and implement climate finance program. Thirdly, it is climate finance should increasingly support local-led adaptations where community between humanitarian, where communities themselves are often have strong knowledge of climate risk and practical solution, but required resource and support to implement these adaptation measures. So fourth, there's a need of long-term and predictable financing that bridge gaps between humanitarian response and climate adaptation. So investment in early warning systems, water resource management, and drought resilient agriculture and ecosystems restorations can significantly also reduces the importance of future climate shocks. So ultimately, closing the climate gaps means ensuring that countries like Somalia, which are on the front line of climate impact, are not left behind in global climate finance effort. So supporting Somalia's climate resilience just is not like only a humanitarian necessity, but it is also investment in long-term stability, development, and sustainable livelihood for millions of people. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great intervention, and you've given us all lots to think about. I hope those online can, and Pam's doing a great job with the microphone. I think from the picture that you've given us of what it's like to think about climate action at the state level and across a whole country, turning to Catherine Loon, I want to zoom in on what effective climate action looks like at the community level. What does climate action look like for communities who are experiencing violence, for communities where state apparatus isn't as present? And maybe within all that, is there anything in the current situation that's giving you a reason to be hopeful?
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this discussion. Good afternoon to all of you. I do want to start, and that's not answering your question, to say that I'm not sure as I'm optimistic on the reset as you are, so we can discuss that further. I would like to be on board with the idea that when we speak of life saving, it's a broad understanding of life saving and protecting life. My sense is that we've deprioritized what helps building the resilience of communities. And we know that this is critical if communities are to be more able to cope with growing climate risks. So I think we need to push for a wide and generous understanding of what is it to protect people's lives. But my concern is that we very much shifted to a response that is kind of trying to address the immediate aftermath of a shock, and that we are disinvesting in the area of even early warning, early action, and probably even more in the broader resilience building agenda. But we can get back to this. A few things. Abdirahman alluded to the fact that a country like Somalia tends to be neglected when it comes to supporting adequate climate action in conflict settings. And this is something that we have definitely seen, that when we look at the flow of climate finance, and we can take that as a proxy for climate action in certain environments, countries in conflict are neglected. And then when we drill further down, we see that in a country in conflict, the portions of the territory that are the most in conflict, so mostly impacted by the violence, and even more those portions of the territory that are not under the control of the state are even more left out. So it's not only that countries themselves are neglected, but inside countries, there are areas that are particularly left out when it comes to climate action. The other thing I wanted to say before I turn to your question more specifically is that, and I think you're the one who alluded to this already, we need to be mindful that humanitarian action does not provide adequate and comprehensive climate adaptation. So it's not something that can replace a much wider holistic plan when it comes to supporting a community or a country to be able to face the impacts of a changing climate. I mean, adequate, comprehensive climate action is likely to be a transformative project. And that means that it's not only changing the type of seeds you use in a given environment, you're probably looking at changing your whole food system and so on. So that's not at the scale of what humanitarian action can do. So that I think we need to be very clear in terms of what are the limitations. Now, what I did want to say and emphasize here is when we started working on what are the impacts of growing climate shocks and climate change in the places where we work, and we saw that there were significant impacts and significant gaps in the response when we started to raise that with states, development banks, so the typical bodies we would engage with to draw attention to the situation and say more support is required. The question that would typically come back is, yes, but what can you truly do in these environments beyond a very kind of emergency type of response? So we decided, and we notably worked with Mercy Corps on this, but we worked with a group of multilateral development banks, humanitarian actors, researchers, to start pulling our heads together and reflect on how do we make the case to say that, in fact, at the local level, there is a lot that we can do that will improve people's ability to cope with shocks and be more resilient in the long term. Because the starting point is we're convinced we can do better. And so we've done quite a bit of research work looking at our own operations, our own practice, and then we also joined forces with ODI to develop some research that looks at the spectrum from fragility to high intensity conflict and what can be done in these various environments, understanding that we tend to group fragility and conflict under one umbrella, which happens to be an extremely wide umbrella that goes from extremely active conflict to institutions that are not extremely well functioning, but still exist and so on. So there we need to unpack a bit what can be done in various environments. What I'm going to focus on in answering your question is conflict. So I will leave the fragility bit out. What I would say on fragility is there is a lot that can be done in these environments. I mean, you are dealing with more stable environments than environments that are affected by conflict. I will still aim to pass the message that in situations of conflict, there are a number of things that can be done, both in terms of strengthening the resilience of communities to various shocks. So it's climate shocks, but it's also other types of shocks and risks. And to ensure that when we've not been able to build the resilience of communities sufficiently, at least we deal with residual risks in a more adapted manner. And that is looking at early warning, early action. So trying to address the risks that will be left. I'm going to state a number of things that you probably all already know, which is what are some of the characteristics of effective responses or climate sensitive responses in conflict settings. So excuse me for stating the obvious, but that's a bit of what we noted across the board when we looked at what is common to the various types of responses. One thing is, and you've alluded to this already, is it's always going to be super context specific in the sense that, I mean, and we know this for every response, there's not one size fits all response. There, what will notably be important to look at is the level of violence. So in protracted conflict, we have ebbs and flows in the violence. You'll have moments of high intensity, moments of much lower intensity, and that enables various different types of responses. Level of development, and Abdirahman spoke of the importance of development when we're looking at climate action. it makes a tremendous difference when you have infrastructure and basic services that exist in a country versus a place where you do not have basic infrastructure and basic services in terms of what type of action we're able to carry out. Effective climate action obviously needs to be conflict sensitive in conflict settings. We do not want, there's the maladaptation element, but there's also the fueling the conflict element. So of course, we do want to bear in mind what could contribute to reinforcing power dynamics and reinforcing the dynamics of the conflict. And we do not want to create or reinforce inequalities when we're looking at what can be done in certain environments. And that seems obvious, but think, for instance, of who we normally provide seeds to. Landowners, people who have access to a piece of land, these might be male. And so, I mean, there are a number of elements to unpack there in terms of who are the typical recipients of certain types of support, notably when it comes to livelihood support, and what is the impact in terms of inequalities in a society. We also considered, and you also alluded to this, that to be effective, these are activities that need to be developed with the local community. We're not going to impose or import solutions in these environments. We tend to be looking at extremely low-tech solutions. We're often looking at solutions that bring us back to past ways of doing a number of things when it comes to farming. And that means that they're developed with the local community, with civil society, with local authorities. And then, of course, bringing in local, national, international actors to provide some support and some expertise. But that is definitely an extremely important element. Who owns what are the type of activities that are being implemented? We're also looking, I spoke of early warning, early action. I spoke of strengthening resilience. We're looking at activities that combine both the very short-term kind of addressing risks and the much longer-term ambitions of ensuring that people plant seeds that will yield proper harvests in the longer run, and so on and so forth. So we're looking at the short-term and the longer-term activities. We're also looking at activities that are adaptable. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to invest in conflict settings. It's because a conflict is unpredictable by definition. So we need to be looking at activities that can be adapted when there are changes in the dynamics of the conflict. And this is where local ownership becomes so important, because there are cases where if we've adequately helped communities integrate certain types of practices or better understand the types of warnings they're receiving, their elements they're able to carry forward. And that to me is absolutely key. It's the ownership of communities to then reduce risks in the longer term. The last thing in terms of common elements, and again, I'm repeating everything you've said, you've also alluded to this, is that we need to be extremely mindful that our action can contribute to maladaptation. And that's something we're struggling with quite significantly, because our usual approach is to help people somehow cope in the environment where they are, right? We'll provide livelihood support, we'll provide greater access to water. There are environments that we know are becoming, or we don't know, we assume are becoming unlivable. And there is a point where helping people stay in place might be exactly what we should not be doing. And that for us is an impossible call to make. But we do see that risk in some places. Maybe we should be facilitating movement rather than facilitating the stay of people in certain environments. I did want to give a few examples of what I'm talking about. And I'm not as good as Paul. I didn't look at my watch before I started, so you stop me when it's too long. So what we did is to look at a number of things we had been able to do in certain environments, and I'm just going to very quickly give a few illustrations there. So in a place like Mozambique, for instance, we were able, so there was pre-existing infrastructure. We were able to work to expand, rehabilitate water systems for communities to have a sustainable access to water. In a place like Niger, we've been able to work with communities in the east of the country, so affected by the ongoing conflict. We've been able to work with communities to mostly go back to practices that have existed in the past, and that is building firewall strips, for instance, to ensure that when there is a fire, it does not just spread across the land. We've been helping to rehabilitate land that had been stripped by the winds and by repeated extremely intensive rains and so on and so forth. And there we've provided seeds that seem to be more adapted to the type of climate we're working in. In the Central African Republic, we worked with herders because there was an increasing problem of violence between herders and farmers. Herders were moving south to gain access to water and pasture, and this is where farmers are having their fields. So we worked with herders and community leaders to try to identify routes that would work for the herders and that would also work for the farmers. And that entailed that we looked at irrigation and water points and so on and so forth. These are mostly efforts that entail bringing communities together and trying to find a common ground, but it does help in terms of addressing risks in the immediate time. I started saying that the intensity of the violence does influence what we're able to do. The three examples I've given now, we were able to carry out most of that work, not in the highest period, the highest intensity of the conflict. What I would say when it becomes a moment of heightened intensity in the conflict, we are mostly looking at what can we do that will not hamper steps that we can take afterwards to build resilience, to ensure that adaptation happens adequately. We tend to turn, and it's probably reasonable, to pure emergency relief in a period of extremely high intensity conflict. And there I'm speaking of emergency medical care, emergency food provision, emergency water provision. So that I think we can nearly carve out as a space where we need to understand that in the midst of a high intensity emergency, the response should not be insensitive to climate risks in the sense that if we see a storm coming, we should take that into account. But I don't think we should have the ambition to be building resilience to climate risk at that point in time. We should just ensure that we're not locking in maladaptation the way we will be providing relief. The last situation I wanted to allude to is territories that are not under the control of the state. The reason why it's important, first of all, because there are a lot of people living in these territories in the world. So we're looking at more than 200 million people who live in territories that are not under the control of the state. So it's not a negligible part of the population. But the reason why I want to insist on this is there is a tendency to exclude these communities from a lot of programs because it's considered more challenging. When it comes to development bodies, that's considered often to be out of scope because these are typically areas where the government will not be working. What I want to insist on here is we're often looking at not only high intensity conflict, we're looking at low to mid intensity conflict where it is possible to act. And I will give one example that is actually an example from Somalia, where in 2023, when there was a warning that El Nino would cause flooding, we worked both with the government and government-controlled territories and with communities and the Somali Red Crescent in Al-Shabaab-controlled territories to ensure that we would be able to protect water points and health clinics if there were floods. And in the end, there were floods. And that entailed prepositioning water bags to protect some of the infrastructure and the water points. It entailed, in some cases, elevating some of the structures. And that proved possible. And it did mean that people kept access to safe water during the floods. And there we worked with the BBC Somalia service to ensure that people would receive timely information about the status of the flood. So in that case, it was actually possible to do early warning, early action type of work in a territory that is not under the control of the state. The one thing I do want to flag in closing is, Abdirahman, you've alluded to the scale of the action that is required, and that's why I started by that. We do not work at the right scale when it comes to addressing everything that needs to be addressed to ensure adequate climate adaptation. So I think our role is critically important, that the message I'd like us all to leave with is it is possible to do some valuable work in these environments, but we also need to continue mobilizing those who can do things at a different scale in these environments. You asked me to speak of what makes me hopeful. I'm actually going to speak of one thing that makes me quite concerned on the mobilizing others. What we've seen is, I mean, those others tend to be development banks because there's been a bit of a fixation on climate funds, but the reality of climate finance is that most of it is channeled by multilateral development banks and not by the emblematic climate funds. What we've seen with development banks, and there are nuances, but we have seen a push to invest in safer environments. It was already there, it's long been there, but there had been a bit of a switch or a shift towards, well, we also need to think a bit about what it means to leave no one behind, and therefore we need to do more in fragile and conflict-affected settings. What we've seen with not all, but some of the development banks is a bit of a reverse of that movement, and that we would consider to be of extreme concern. Yeah. Thank you, and you've let me speak for too long.
No, thank you. We were hanging on every word, and you've also given me the absolute perfect segue into the next question to Anna, which is, we've heard from all the speakers, especially Abdirahman and Catherine Loon, how important these big scale actors are, these actors that can do things at a different scale. And we've heard warning bells sounded by several speakers about how that tentative progress of these big development actors, these big climate funds doing a bit more in fragile contexts, risks being reversed. It's an impossible advocacy environment at the moment. The public support for humanitarian aid, development aid is being undercut. Climate is a dirty word, as Paul said. Mercy Corps has done so much work in trying to advocate for these big development and climate finance bodies to do more in the most vulnerable places. What is it going to take now to sustain that progress and move the needle? What do we all need to be doing on the advocacy front?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I completely agree with everything that you've just said. I'm worried I'm going to sound slightly repetitive, but it's comforting for me that I'm saying the same as you rather than something completely different. So that is a big question. I guess we were also very concerned as ODA budgets started to shrink that there would be a retreat from donors to purely life-saving assistance and also spending in safer environments where it was much easier for them to invest. Partly because there is, you know, a lot of pressure on ODA being as effective as possible, and that there's a bit of a reluctance to take risks. So one thing that we have been working on over the last less than a year, which is funded by the FCDO, is an initiative called the Resilience Learning Facility, which has sought to show that actually, even in some of the most fragile settings, be that a high intensity conflict or constrained access environments, it is actually possible and sometimes very effective to be building climate and community resilience. And I completely agree, sometimes that might not be super ambitious. It might be more about protecting productive capacity during a shock rather than, you know, trying to make gains. But yeah, I think it's really important for donors, be them bilateral or sort of the banks, to really understand that it is possible and very effective to build resilience in these settings. So this facility has looked at, you know, a number of contexts, one being the Sahel, which obviously has, you know, communities facing environmental, political, economic fragility, which is sort of compounding and exacerbating existing state weakness. We have looked at a program called the JAZZ program, which is supporting the government in their sort of capacity to strengthen land governance by both strengthening local governance structures at the same time as doing some sort of targeted natural resource management, which has been able to support both climate adaptation and conflict mitigation. In Sudan, so another very tricky operating environment, we looked at the SAFE program, which had a market systems development approach before the conflict erupted. Connecting farmers with seed distributions, village level agents, microfinance institutions. And what's interesting about this program is when the conflict did break out, the program didn't set up sort of parallel humanitarian systems, but actually pivoted and worked through existing private sector partners and community networks to decentralize some of that seed distribution, to ensure that that was getting out before the planting season, to temporarily increase subsidies to offset inflation, and really sort of working through these local community groups who are already there. So that all being well and good, we're building off what other partners have done to show that there is stuff you can do in these contexts, even when things are very, very difficult. But obviously, the current architecture is really not mobilizing the scale of funding needed, and it's really limiting the ability of communities to lead in adapting to climate change and building resilience. And I think it's a really tricky question, because in a shrinking fiscal space, we are all going to have to do more with less, which is quite terrifying considering, you know, how things were in previous years. But I think that means a couple of things. I think that means greater coordination across and with donors. It means pooling resources to fund what is proven to work. So take markets, for example. More people rely on markets and community networks to respond to shocks and stressors than ever receive humanitarian or development aid. And quite often those local market sector actors remain operational even when national level supply chains and institutions fail. So we really need to strengthen existing market systems and local private sector actors to make sure that they are more sustainable and resilient to shocks moving forward. Part of that means we need to be a little bit, and this is not new, be a little bit more ambitious and creative about how we get finance to the people who need it most, so that they can learn to adapt by doing without this sort of very high risk burden. So donors, including IFIs, banks, need to prioritize modalities that allow communities to adapt without that risk burden, and sort of shifting power, decision-making resources to the local level. That's currently quite difficult, and there's lots of things that we could do to make it easier. So, you know, dedicated funding windows, or simplifying and right-sizing financial and accreditation processes, so that small scale and local level actors can actually access the funding in the first place. This, I'll wrap up very quickly, but this is going to take sustained political will. I think that's my main message, that we know this is possible. I believe donors know this is possible. You know, they're very aware of the climate fragility gap, and we've made a lot of progress over the last couple of years. So we need to keep making the case, keep showing the evidence that this is not only effective and possible, but actually is a really good use of their money.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am sure that everyone in this room is sitting on lots of burning questions, and I do want to make sure that we have time to get there. Did I see, however, that Abdi Kadir has joined us online? If so, in which case I've asked Abdi Kadir to just quickly ground truth us, if you'll excuse the pun, and reflect on having heard from the state level, having heard from, you know, interagency level, from international organizations, from, you know, Paul's perspective across the landscape. Does everything that you've heard on the panel today make sense from the perspective of the communities that you work with in Somalia? And what are communities in Somalia calling for at the moment to help them adapt to and thrive through climate change? So Abdi Kadir, I'm passing you the mic, and I'm very unfairly just going to give you a couple of minutes so we've got time to hear from the audience in the room. But Abdi Kadir, over to you.
Thank you, Amela. Pleasure to join you. Belated, it was the iftar time. We were breaking the Ramadan. within the meeting. That's my apologies on that. In terms of what you have discussed today, at the different levels, I think all these are case scenarios emanating from the different organizations working in different global scenarios within the climate affected countries. In terms of what has already been said, these are genuine case scenarios and practical solutions in terms of communities that we work with across Somalia. Currently, there is climate-related drought affecting most of the communities, and the major requirement currently is water shortage and pasture for animals, and depletion of livelihoods as a result of that, caused by depletion of the pasture and lack of water. Those are the main priorities now. But I will add also in terms of prioritization, the best way, the best approach, which we have been using recently, is doing community action plans with the communities that are affected, coming up with their priorities through community action plans, and having discussion with them at district level, and making sure the priorities are harmonized at district level from the different villages. Actually, this will ensure, coordinated response where the area-based coordinations at the district level tackle are using the minimal resource that are available due to diminishing donor funding recently. So that is one of the best ways to make sure value for money is making sure prioritization and community action plan at community levels. For Samsung Foundation, where I work with, I think in 2024 alone, to reduce this, we have drilled 20 boreholes, new boreholes across Somalia, and another 24 boreholes rehabilitated. That is 44, just to make sure that, the drought effect in relation to water is reduced. And this was support from King Salman Foundation. So other projects are there also that are supporting communities across this. We have the Somali Humanitarian Fund currently ongoing, supporting one district at Hudur and many other districts that were severely affected by drought. All these, have to be coordinated at district level through the area-based coordination to make sure value for money. In terms of adaptations, I think it is best practical to work with the local communities and creating, harmony between the modern and traditional methods of adaptations in relation to climate related shocks, including information sharing about the triggers and the early response and resilience and adaptations. All these have to go together to make sure the people always recover from disasters. Any delay in any of the trigger response might cost a lot in terms of manpower and in terms of resource if it's not treated at early level. So that's my addition in terms of the experiences we had from the communities, how best to work with the local communities, harmonizing the traditional climate adaptation methods alongside the modern methods, and creating at village levels community resilience committees which are trained and capacity built on adaptations and all that, and ensuring that the resources are efficiently used through prioritization within the communities, because some of the communities are willing to provide and you know uh, add the resource, the support that is required to tackle the climate issues. So it is always an opportunity to know the community contribution through the discussions with the community, having community resilience committees and early warning, early response subcommittees within the resilience committees that you know monitor the triggers and provide info to the national platforms. I think that's the future and ensuring you know climate adaptations are locally rooted and you know ensuring these are reaching the lowest level of people through localization, where the village level committees have the capacities to respond to the shock themselves without little or no support from donors or that, and that is where we want to achieve at sustainability level in future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been so helpful to have those reflections from the communities that you work with. I'm going to open now for questions, and we'll go first, if audience online will forgive me, to those in the room. We'll take a few questions at one time. So is anyone sitting on any burning questions for the panelists in the room? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Barbara from FCDO. So my question is on scalability. It's been really interesting to hear, obviously, your reflection, and particularly from Abdulrahman on the need to improve accessibility of climate finance in fragile and conflict affected states. And I think looking at some of the work that our teams do, or that IFIs do, we're also really mindful that there's an awful lot more we could do around helping national and local governments with budget execution and mobilization of domestic resources for resilience and adaptation. On the humanitarian side, it sometimes feels, and not specifically in this discussion, but more generally, that scalability and sustainability sometimes feel like someone else's problem. Yeah. So we're very good at rolling out those emergency models that we then sustain for 20 years on end, expecting that somebody else will come in and take over and essentially help with the transition. And I suppose across protracted crisis, which absorbed most of humanitarian funding, we've seen that, well, you know, we're stuck, we're there, we remain stuck. And that was a problem long before the funding crisis of the last year. So my question is, if you had your sort of top 3 recommendations for what we, particularly as humanitarians, could do differently to address that problem of scalability of very, very good projects for resilience and adaptation, but that aren't necessarily right now scalable on the level of need in some of the countries we're discussing, what would be your top 3 recommendations?
Great, thank you. A tough question, which I love. We'll be giving our panelists time to think about that. Yes, over to you.
Thank you. Johan Eldebo from World Vision. Picking up a little bit on that question, I was at a conference last week in London on the Humanitarian Finance Summit, which had some of these topics as well. One of the topics that came up related to financing and where the money goes was the risk appetite element, and where humanitarian financing likes to go to Afghanistan and other complex places, and climate financing likes to go to Kenya. So I guess my question for this panel is how do we change the risk appetite or risk tolerance, and I guess risk management of people who sit on climate and innovative financing, so that they, in addition to going to Kenya, also like Afghanistan and Goma, Eastern Congo, those places?
Great question, and you have the right people on the panel to answer it. So that's excellent. I'll take one more question from this round. Yes, please.
No, thank you, Alan Kalma from the Lutheran World Federation. I think what struck me was, you know, when you were doing the opening, Sophia, you mentioned that some of these local communities in Somalia, for example, sorry, you talk about Somalia, I should be talking about the Philippines as well. But no, but I think one of the things that struck me was the fact that they're saying that, you know, they have these local initiatives, and all they needed was to sort of like have that additional funding to really sustain it and scale it up, maybe, and have that ripple effect. The problem is that they're not getting it. Yeah. And for me, like previously, even before this cuts and stuff, we had this problem about I think humanitarian organizations, and that's why I agree with Catherine Luna, like I think humanitarian funding may not be that mechanism to solve all that problem, because we have this vulnerability criteria where in a way it kind of like disincentivize any community which has already started doing something. Because then you focus on communities which haven't done anything and are extremely vulnerable. And I worry that in this world of hyper prioritization, where now we're talking only about responding to severity 4 and severity 5, which actually means in practice that if a community, for example, has already started after a conflict and there's the response coming from organizations, and you see a community who has been able to start something up and just needs a push, and then you compare it with the community who hasn't been able to do anything, where do you think the funding will go in a hyper prioritized world? And I think to me that is the danger, that because we're pushing on life-saving mechanism, that narrative of focusing on life-saving, that we probably would miss a lot of these opportunities of building up on efforts that is already present and our people are actually doing, and then therefore creating more dependency on a system that's already severely strained. So I guess my question is, how do we start resolving that dilemma when we are where we are at the moment? Because I don't think we can do more with less. I really don't like that. But I think we really need to be more effective in how we spend the money that we have. But for us to be able to do that, there has to be more agility and flexibility in the funding that we receive. Thanks.
Great question. Three great questions. Thank you very much. So just to pre-warn the panelists, I'm going to turn first to Paul, then to Abdirahman, then to Catherine Loon, and then to Anna. I'll suggest the questions that I think you might want to answer, but you take whatever question makes sense to you. So, Paul, it seems to me that the scalability question is a good one for you to tackle, but tackle whichever of those questions makes sense.
Thanks, Steve. I think I have a sense that the questioners actually know the answer far better than I do. So I could be unkind, Barbara, and just ask you for the answer, but some thoughts on it. I mean, what I heard from the panel coming up in different ways were the importance of interventions really at two levels, gap filling at two levels. Gap filling sort of at the level of individuals, communities, which is often around information and provision of agency. That the cheap way, if you like, of addressing this is giving people that little piece of information that they don't have, which is often about future risk, because people are very good at how they've dealt with risks in the past. So RCCE and those kind of activities at the community level. So that was one level, and I think that is extremely scalable. Actually, I think knowledge is one of the things that scales very cheaply, and I think that's true both when you're looking at, and it's interesting to see how many of the NAPs in these climate conflict environment have sort of public education or climate education as a key part of that. So it's not the whole answer, but I think there's a piece in there which is about what are the things that people don't know that if they do know, they would act differently. I also think this is not necessarily something that everyone would agree with, but I also think a challenge that we have with climate thinking and a lot of humanitarian thinking is that we've come in from the successes of cash and the markets, and those have been, undoubtedly those have been extremely successful in humanitarian practice in many, many ways. They are not systemic in the way that some other sectors of endeavor are systemic, for example, health or education. And I think it's probably harder to get systemic things happening in the sort of livelihoods and economic development arena than it is, say, in a health system. Some of the, and again, I recognize it's not the whole answer, but some of the most I think good return on investment scalable work I've seen over the last year has been conducted by IMC, International Medical Corps, and Oxfam, to name drop a little bit, around extreme heat. And it's gone at these two levels. So it's gone at the knowledge level, and that this is going to get worse, kind of community education around heat. But it's also said, you know, you have a health system, and systems can be, or you can support change in systems by capacity development. So training clinical staff, training managers of health facilities, which you can scale fairly easily by putting it into the syllabus, because there is a standard pre-service and in-service training. And so what IMC is trying to do is move from doing trainings to have the Ministry of Health certify and include these. It's only 3 days of training in the syllabus, and that scales immediately, very quick, you know, very, very effectively. You can also do things, and it's interesting that in South Sudan, where I was lucky to be recently, again around heat, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education are looking into what would be some just basic criteria for building education facilities or BOMA healthcare facilities so that they weren't dangerous. And something as simple as just kind of planning regs for those public buildings. Again, you don't necessarily have the money to build the buildings, but you know that a variety of lots of different actors are going to come in and build schools. Yeah, they're going to come in and build clinics. You can say that it is a requirement that you don't build these things with sort of sheet metal roofs that haven't been painted. So I think that's a long and slightly discursive answer, but I think there are examples of, if you want to scale it, you have to start by wanting to scale it and look what the mechanism is going to be, and that will often be knowledge at the community level, and it will also be working where there is already a system which is competent to scale that thing up. I'll stop there. More thoughts on that, but I'd just be going on.
Abdi Rahman, we're going to turn to you next, if that's okay. It would seem to me to make sense for you to reflect on what it has taken in your engagement with climate finance and development institutions to help them get comfortable working in places that they haven't before. But again, feel free to respond to any of the questions that make sense to you.
Thank you, Sophia. You saw that it's a very fantastic question. Really appreciated. You see that scalability of climate finance in the fragile context, like let's talk about Somalia. Scaling climate finance in fragile and conflict-affected settings is another major challenge because traditional climate finance systems were largely designed for stable development context, not a complex environmental like Somalia. So for climate finance to scale effectively, and several structure change are needed. So first, they must be simplified and more accessible funding pathway where global climate funds such as Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility play an important role, but the application process can be highly technical and resource intensive. So fragile states often lack the institutional capacity required to navigate this process quickly. And it normally creates simplified access windows where technical support facilities and dedicated financing stream for fragile context can significantly increase access to the climate finance. So secondly, scalability required strong national ownership and coordination mechanisms where climate finance must align with the national adaptation plan and the climate strategies and development priorities, normally strengthen government institution and coordination mechanisms, which normally ensures that the climate investment and strategic, transparent, and sustainable. So thirdly, we must place a much greater emphasis on local load adaptations locally, like local government, community organizations, civil society groups, and other often the first responders to the climate impact and have deep knowledge of local risk and solutions. However, they frequently received only a very small share of a global climate finance. Direct fund mechanisms that can reach local actors can dramatically increase both effectiveness and scalability of climate adaptation. Fourthly, I can talk about scalability required integrating programming across sectors like climate adaptation in fragile context and cannot be addressed in isolation, like water management, agricultural, health systems, disaster risk reductions, livelihood support are all interconnected. So you see that these integrated programs that allows climate finance to deliver product development and resilience outcomes. You see that some of the international communities must support long-term and predictable financing rather than short funding cycles. You know that climate adaptation required sustained investment over many years, because predictable funding enables government and community to plan, implement, and scale adaptation strategies effectively. So finally, climate finance also requires strong partnership between government, international organizations, and development banks, NGOs, and the private sectors. No single actors can address the climate change because alone. A collaborative approach can help to mobilize the resource and ensure that the climate investment reach vulnerable populations. So in fragile context, like let me take an example of Somalia, is calling climate finance is not only about increasing fund level, but it's also designing financing systems that are flexible, inclusive, and capable of operating in complex environment. So if this system evolve better, to be better reflect the reality of fragile state. So we say that climate finance can become a powerful tool for strengthening resilience, reducing where humanitarian needs, and supporting sustainable development. There's another question that was being asked, my friend, that is the how risk resilience adaptation when it comes to how do we change the risk in finances. In our context, like one of our co-challenge in financing climate resilience in fragile context like Somalia is how risk is perceived by international financing institutions and climate fund. And often fragility, political instability, institutional limitation led financiers to classify countries like Somalia as a high risk environment. So which makes funding slower, more restrictive, and sometimes inaccessible. So however, the reality is not investing in resilience carriers at much greater long-term risk, but both financially and socially. So when climate adaptation is underfunded, then there is a consequence appear in form of repeated humanitarian crisis like food insecurity, displacement, economic disruptions. Then the cost of responding to the emergency repeated is often much higher than the investing resilience beforehand. So to change this dynamic, we need to shift conversation from risk avoidance to risk management and risk sharing. So you see that firstly, we talk about climate finance mechanism should be incorporate risk sharing instrument, which also these include tools such as a blended finance, that is concessional loans, that's grants and insurance mechanisms that allow international institutions to absorb part of the financial risk while enabling investment in fragile context countries. You see that there's some financing mechanisms must also become more flexible and adaptive. For example, climate program in fragile context often, for example, faces unpredictable conditions, whether climate shocks, conflict dynamic, or institutional challenge, and all those institutional challenge. But flexible finance structure allows a program to adjust like activities while still achieving long-term resilient outcomes. So you see that this financing must also, there's another case which normal financing must prioritize anticipatory and preventive approach, investing in early warning system, climate data systems, drought preparedness, water infrastructure, all those things. Because before they occur, in many cases, every dollar invested in disaster risk reductions save multiple dollars in future humanitarian response. So you see that these are critical strengthening national institutional capacity so that government can manage climate finance effectively. Institutions like the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Somalia play a central role in coordinating climate strategies where we ensure accountability, align international funding with national priorities. And finally, we need strong alignment between humanitarian financing, development financing, climate financing in fragile context. Also, these are often treated separately, but in reality, they are deeply interconnected. Integrating this approach and allows financing to support both immediate needs and long-term resilience. So ultimately, changing the perception of risk means recognizing the climate adaptation investment in the fragile context are not risky, but they are essential in risk reduction strategies. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent point. And I think this point about bringing together all of the different strategies and funding streams is one that at this conference that we're at the moment is always a hot topic and something that we really struggle with. So thank you for raising that. Catherine Loon, I'm going to turn to you next. My suggestion would be also thinking about how to change the risk appetite of development actors and climate institutions, but also if you have any thoughts on this very interesting question about how do we make sure that we're not disincentivizing community action.
I'm still going to address briefly the first question. I would completely echo you on scalability and sustainability being connected to knowledge and education. And there I would also speak of the use of radio and those media that reach people and have a key role to play in education. I would add to that that when it comes to scale, the use of networks can play a very critical role. I mean, Abdikadir alluded to community action plans. These are typically developed at a local level with some support. So if you look at the Red Cross, Red Crescent volunteers, for instance, that work in communities, if you look at local organizations that are part of the Caritas network and so on and so forth, you have networks like that that can play an absolutely critical role in replicating and embedding in communities and supporting the development. So there I would say, and we see this as well with basic agricultural techniques that can be useful. So there you do have potential for spreading a number of things across countries. So that we need not to underestimate. It's not the ICRC or Mercy Corps themselves that can do that work, but I think through the use of networks, we have a potential for scaling up action. The other thing I would say, and especially looking at it from a government perspective, is mobilize your development arm. I mean, we do know that a part of the equation is related to development, and then mobilize the boards of the multilateral development banks and the climate finance, the climate funds, because a lot of donors do sit on these boards and have a critically influential voice. On the risk appetite question, you're absolutely right. And what I would say is we're completely filled with contradictions, because if you look at Agenda 2030, the motto is leave no one behind. That should translate into how do we reach those hardest to reach, most vulnerable communities. We do not see it radically translated into practice. When it comes to climate finance, the motto is support the adaptation of the most vulnerable. That would also entail that you focus on fragile and conflict affected settings. So I do not have a solution to this, but to me, there's a big tension between what are the commitments and what is happening in practice. And I'm going to go back to the role of board members. When we've looked at the composition of the boards of multilateral development banks and climate funds, and you hardly find one country entering conflict on these boards. And ultimately, these are driving the decisions in terms of what will be the acceptable risk threshold, what will we prioritize. And of course, the calculus is always extremely challenging, because you have a finite amount of money, you're trying to do the most you can with that finite amount of money. And if you're going to invest in a complex setting, well, the risks are greater that your money will not yield the results that you want to see. So we would never advocate for all of the money to be dedicated to complex settings, but we would surely advocate for striking a better balance. And there I would really underscore the critical role of who's part of a board and how do we work with these board members. And I think there we have a slight issue of representation. On disincentivizing community level action, I mean, I'd go back to the point of enabling action rather than imposing action and ensuring ownership and so on and so forth. So to me, there's a question of what type of action are we talking about? I do not think when it comes to reducing climate risk that, I mean, I do not think in general that the right action is one that is imposed on communities. But that's even more true when we're looking at how do you adapt to a changing environment, because it's ultimately about how do I use water, how do I farm and so on, and that needs to be locally owned. So if done rightly, you should be incentivizing local action rather than disincentivizing local action. But I completely hear your point in terms of how much disruption you can be creating in this.
So with an eye on the time, I'm sorry, I'd hoped to do another round of questions, but the answers were excellent. So I'm happy in a way that we haven't. With an eye on the time, I'm going to turn to you, Anna, for any reflections on any of the questions, and then ask you to do our closing challenge. I had originally asked members of the panel to give one big risk, one thing that's keeping them awake at night, and one reason to be hopeful or optimistic that we can navigate a way through this challenge of worsening climate challenges, less money, less focus, more disparateness between different actors. But I think we've heard lots of risks, lots of reasons to worry on the panel. So I'm going to ask each panelist just to focus on one reason to be hopeful, one little glimmer of optimism. Anna, any answers to the questions? And then your optimistic glimmer, please.
Yeah, the questions, I've just written scalability, question mark in big letters. I'm really, I'm really glad that sort of local level planning, whether that's LAPAs or TAPs or whatever, either community structures or sort of local and provincial level governments has come up. And they're so important. I think quite often the question is, okay, you've embedded that into your planning. How are we going to pay for those actions that you've outlined? And I think, as Abdurrahman was saying, when we talk about risk, we also need to talk about the other side, which is trust. So maybe we need to be more comfortable with delivering smaller envelopes of funding that we have less oversight over, so that the adaptation actions identified by a community and their local representatives can actually be carried out. That will obviously be relatively small scale, but I think that's how you start to build that up and it becomes more integrated into national planning. And so I'm really glad that featured. Oh, and just to say that obviously that funding would need to be incredibly flexible as well. That's how it's going to be able to respond to challenges as they occur. On the question around what we do about MDBs and broader IFIs, I don't have an answer to that, but just to say that we are working quite closely with a set number of IFIs on exactly how to scale up some of their most promising practices, and also specifically looking at the role of catalytic funds. So how potentially smaller pots of money from, say, bilateral donors can leverage a much larger project. So, for example, the DRIVE program under the risk finance umbrella. I don't have the answers to that yet, but we will be sharing them with SDO when we've got them at the end of this month. Thanks. Oh, and my optimism. Yeah. I'll keep it short. I think everyone's already said this, but in these very often fragile settings, communities quite often already know how to adapt to climate change and what needs to be done. And in many places are already doing it. And I think where adaptation and resilience are supported, we're seeing amazing successes, and we're seeing the communities who are leading those interventions keen to scale them up and seeing the benefits. So I think that's a positive thing. I think although it can be frustrating that maybe the finance is not following as quickly as we would like, I mean, change does take time, and I think we've just got to keep the momentum up and keep showcasing all the amazing work that's being done in communities around the world.
Great reason for optimism. Thank you very much. Abdurrahman, if we could turn to you now for your reason to be hopeful, just leave this audience with something that they can find optimism in this space.
Sophia Ritani, please.
Sorry, it was can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I was muted, sorry.
No problem. The question is just, in one sentence, what would you leave this audience with as something that they can feel hopeful about, something in this space that should give you cause for hope and optimism?
Thank you, Sophia. I can live on the ground that you know that, for example, like there's so many interventions that we see, and I will leave that from my perspective that the biggest risk for Somalia is growing gap between the scale of climate impact and the level of support available to address them. And you know that there's a lot of shock speech ongoing in Somalia are becoming more frequent and more intensive, So in these gaps are widen, we risk seeing the situations where communities are trapped in permanent cycles of crisis and recovery. So, however, despite this challenge, there's also strong reasons for optimism. And while the risks are significant for the combination of community resilience and local knowledge and increased global attention to climate justice, give us a strong foundation for hope. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent reason for optimism. Catherine Loon, we'll turn to your optimistic glimmer next.
I mean, the fact that we're still having these discussions and that organizations remain committed to working in this space gives me hope. And there I would mention the work of the Climate and Environment Charter Secretariat and the fact that there are still a massive number of organizations that do want to discuss these issues, have questions about how to integrate this properly into their programs and so on. And that's actively going on. So that gives me hope. I think there's been, as you mentioned, it's really that, but I also think that there's a recognition that the work needs to continue because communities need it. So that gives me hope.
Great source of inspiration. And Paul, the very last word of this panel is with you. Reasons to be hopeful.
Well, I can't think of anything particularly hopeful around the finances. But I think there's a lot to be hopeful about in terms of how the finances are turned into programming. Because it works best because of the contextual nature of the challenge, the programming is best where the decisions are made closest to the challenge. And if finally the humanitarian system is able to move a little closer to its rhetoric, we will see humanitarian decisions being made closer to the challenges. So I think that's great. And because programming is better, as Abdurrahman said, when it's not sort of siloed, it needs a whole of government, a whole of system approach where you're tying food security and nutrition and health and water together. I'm actually, if I may, give the last word to my colleagues Vincent and Fissa in Juba, who just finished doing a piece of work on heat wave preparedness. And they said, and they were doing it with a variety of government ministries, and they said the great thing about it was the government ministries at the end said that this was the first time that they had actually met in a forum together to discuss a problem. So what would it be like if actually climate change wasn't just the problem, but climate change was a medium for the solution of getting disparate actors to work more closely together?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're at time, and I know all of you have networking events to run off to. So I want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists today. I've really learned so much from everything that you said. It's been incredibly rich. We could have let this panel run for another hour and I think still be on the edge of our seats. So thank you so much for taking the time, in particular to Abdi Kadir and Abdi Rahman, who've joined very late in the evening.
Thank you very much.
And to all of you who've taken time out of your day to come, listen, ask excellent questions. Thank you for being here. Please, if you want to join our so far slightly loosely organized effort to build something collective in the run-up to COP31, get in touch, drop me an email. Looking forward to discussing what we can do together. So thank you so much.
And just to echo the scaling question, we have tomorrow a session on financing and scaling for resilience building at community level. What works, what's missing. We have Anna also on the panel and a few others on the panel sharing some lessons learned. It's from 2 to 3:30 p.m. at SAL 14. So please do come listen on what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, SAL 4. Wrong one. SAL 4, which is on the basement. So look forward to seeing you and to share some more experiences on the ground.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Thanks.